Have you ever just stopped and looked at the stuff around you? You know, the phone in your pocket, the car you might drive, even the shirt you're wearing. The story of how all that stuff got to you, how our world got so incredibly connected, so fast. Well, it's one of the biggest transformations of our time. It's a story of insane speed and massive change. And to really get a handle on the world today, we've got to understand how this whole global machine was built. So let's dive in.
You know, if you just rewind the clock a few decades, things looked completely different. Take India, for example. If you wanted to buy a car, your choice was pretty much an Ambassador or a Fiat. That's it. The world of products you could buy was basically defined by what was made right there, inside your own country's borders.
Okay, now fast forward to today. That world is almost unrecognizable, right? We're swimming in a sea of brands. You can get cars from pretty much every major company on the planet, the latest phones, TVs, even fruit juices from halfway around the world. This incredible amount of choice is something we just take for granted now.
So, what on earth happened? How did our world of choices just explode like that and so quickly? What were the forces at play that completely redrew the map of how things are made and sold? That is the big question, and that's exactly what we're about to break down.
The short answer? Well, production itself was totally reinvented. A new kind of company stepped onto the scene and built something the world had never seen before, a truly global assembly line.
And the main character in this story is the multinational corporation, or MNC. Now, here's the key thing to get. An MNC doesn't just sell its products everywhere, it makes them everywhere, owning or controlling different pieces of the production process in a bunch of different countries. So, what does this actually look like? Let's take a classic example. An MNC might design its new gadget in the United States. Then, it'll have the components made in China, where manufacturing is cheaper. After that, those parts get shipped to, say, Mexico or somewhere in Eastern Europe for assembly, because they're closer to big markets like the US and Europe. And, to top it all off, the customer service for that product, which is sold all over the world, might be handled by a call center in India. It's this incredibly complex global dance.
So you might be wondering, why go through all that logistical hassle? It's simple, really. The cost savings are absolutely staggering. We're talking as much as 50 to 60%. That is a revolutionary number. It's not just about being a little more efficient. It's this huge, powerful incentive that fuels the entire global system, all in the name of bigger profits.
So how do these MNCs actually get their hooks into different countries and control this whole global production chain? Well, they've got a few key strategies. First, they can partner up with local companies, like Ford did with Mahindra and Mahindra in India. Second, they can just straight up buy out smaller local competitors. The American company Cargill Foods did this when it bought Parak Foods, and boom, overnight it became a massive player in India's edible oil market. Or third, they could just place enormous orders with small independent producers, basically controlling everything, from the price to delivery to labor conditions, without ever owning the factory itself.
Now, this new global system has unleashed some incredible economic power, for sure. But that power hasn't touched everyone equally. In fact, you could say that for every big winner in this story, there's often been a loser.
Let's look at the two sides of the coin. On one hand, for a lot of consumers, especially those in cities, it's been fantastic. We get way more choice, lower prices, and access to products that can improve our standard of living. And hey, new jobs are created in certain industries, which is a huge plus. But that very same wave of global competition can be absolutely devastating for small, local producers who just can't keep up and end up shutting down. And for workers, well, jobs can become a whole lot less secure.
To really feel the human cost, let's look at the story of a guy named Ravi. He'd built a pretty successful company making electronic parts called capacitors. But then the government removed restrictions on imports. All of a sudden, his clients could buy the exact same part from a giant MNC for half the price. He had no choice but to let most of his workers go, and a lot of his friends in the same business, they had to shut down completely.
And it's not just the owners of small companies who feel the squeeze. That pressure lands squarely on the workers, too. Take the story of Sushila, a garment worker. She used to have a permanent job, with benefits and security. But facing intense pressure from global competitors, her factory switched to hiring workers flexibly. And what does that mean? It means hiring people on a temporary basis, no security, no benefits, and often lower pay. The pressure to cut costs just gets passed all the way down the chain.
Okay, so we've seen what happened and the impact it's had, but why? Why did all of this happen so incredibly fast, especially over the last few decades? Turns out there were three key engines of change running at full throttle. These three factors all came together at the same time to make this rapid global connection possible. First, some amazing leaps in technology. Second, a major shift in government policy towards something called liberalization. And third, a pretty strong push from some powerful international organizations.
If you look at the timeline, you can see exactly how this all unfolded. For decades after independence, India used trade barriers, things like taxes on imports, to protect its own young industries. But at the same time, technology was just marching forward. Shipping containers made moving stuff across oceans way cheaper and faster. And then came the real game changer, the IT and internet revolution. Suddenly, that complex global dance we talked about, designing in the US, making parts in China, assembling in Mexico, could be coordinated instantly and cheaply. That technological leap is what made the global assembly line truly possible on a massive scale. And all of this set the stage for a big change around 1991 when India decided the time was right to start removing its own barriers.
And that idea of removing barriers is the core of what we call liberalization. It's basically when a government decides, okay, we're going to impose fewer restrictions on trade. We're going to let goods be imported and exported more easily, and we're going to let foreign companies come in and set up factories and offices.
Now, this shift wasn't just happening in one country here and there. It was being pushed on a global scale by organizations like the World Trade Organization or the WTO. It was started mainly at the initiative of developed countries, and its stated goal is to liberalize international trade and make sure all countries play by the same set of rules.
But here is where things get really contentious. Because even though the WTO is supposed to be all about free trade, a lot of developing countries argue that the rules aren't really applied fairly. This quote, it just captures their argument perfectly. They're basically saying, hey, we've done our part. We've removed our trade barriers just like the WTO rules said. But you guys, the developed countries, you've ignored the rules and have kept giving your own farmers massive government payments or subsidies. This makes their farm products artificially cheap and pretty much impossible for our farmers to compete with. So they're asking a very legitimate question. Is this really free and fair trade?
And that question leads us to the final and maybe the most important part of this whole story, the ongoing struggle to make this incredibly powerful force of globalization work better for everyone.
Look, we can't really turn back the clock. Globalization is here to stay. It is our reality. So the critical question we all face now is, how do we make it more fair? How can we make sure that its benefits are shared more equitably? And there are potential paths forward. Governments can play a huge role here. They can make sure labor laws are actually enforced to protect workers' rights. They can support small producers, like Robbie, to help them compete. They can even use trade barriers when necessary. And they can band together to negotiate for fairer rules of the WTO. But crucially, people themselves have power too, by forming organizations, by launching campaigns, and by making their voices heard to influence these massive decisions from the ground up.
So we'll end on this. What we've seen is that globalization can create enormous opportunities for everybody. But there's no magic invisible hand that's going to make sure its benefits are distributed fairly. And that leaves us with one last crucial question to think about. Who is actually responsible for making sure that these benefits reach everyone?